Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Sphere podcast. We are still doing this with very low production values, so you will have to excuse us for noises, things crashing. We recorded another episode where I was surprised by my dog, so anything might happen. This is basically the Titanic. But today I'm joined. By the way, this is not the third episode; it's actually the fourth episode. As I was saying, very low production values. This is basically shot in a cave in Romania. So anyway, this week I have with me the highly intelligent and astute Patrick T. Brown, who works for my former employer, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where he focuses on the crucial topic of family policy. But why don't you introduce yourself in a sort of more full way?
Oh well, thank you, and yes, I'm glad we're keeping with the low production value. We don't want to get anybody's expectations too high in terms of what the content will be like here. But no, I'm Patrick Brown, as you mentioned, with EPPC now since 2021. Before that, I was on the Hill and doing other various things about town. I live in Columbia, South Carolina, and basically love to talk and think and work on family policy, because if you approach it from the right angle, anything can be family policy. So it touches on so many questions about fertility, marriage, housing, healthcare, all that kind of stuff can either contribute towards or militate against a more pro family America. And so that's what I'm trying to work on these days.
So I did a lot of homework and a lot of research for this interview, and so I wrote down a lot of prep. And so I have two lines. One says "Why family policy," and then the next one says "What family policy." So let's start with the first one. A lot of people who were listening to us may disagree with the very note, or maybe skeptical with the very notion that America should have a family policy. They would say, we have a constitutional system based on limited government, based on the rights of the individual. If people want to get married, not get married, that's fine. If people want to have children, not have children, that's fine. And it's not the government's job to try to have a pro or anti family policy. So, what would you say to these people?
Well, you're always going to have some kind of approach to these questions. And the question is whether you do that deliberately or by accident, right? I mean, you can design a tax code like the one that we have now, where we've essentially addressed most of the marriage penalties for upper income earners, or for families with big differences in income between one spouse and the other. But if you're two low income individuals getting married, you do face as sometimes massive marginal tax rates, negative marginal tax rates. If you're getting married and you're thinking, what's this going to do to our finances, you can be losing safety net benefits, your taxes could go up and that sort of thing. So we're indirectly subsidizing cohabitation rather than marriage, which I think that the research is pretty much in at this point, that's better for the kids that are being raised in that family, and also for the adults in that relationship as well. So it's impossible, I think, to say, well, we're just going to be totally neutral when it comes to questions that lie at the heart of a life well lived, right? What sort of family structure is best, and should we even be encouraging family over just sort of a life of atomized individualism? uh, and so we can be more or less aggressive on that, right? And so that's where especially on the right, there's people who are willing to say, yeah, sign me up, full on Orban style, post-liberal family policy in a sense. We really only have a prescriptive role about what policy making should be advancing, and then some who would say, okay, I'm only on board as far as getting rid of the bad stuff, and then beyond that, we'll let a thousand flowers bloom. I try not to be terribly doctrinaire on these questions, because I don't think it's especially interesting to say, well, you know, the child tax credit, for example. I'm in favor of that only if it's if it's tax cuts. But as soon as you start providing a refundable value to families that don't make a lot of money, well, that becomes welfare, and therefore, yeah, that to me is just an accounting exercise. Are we actually in favor of working class families who may not be making 50, $40,000 a year or not? That to me is less interesting to like what is the principled, Hayekian view about what a totally neutral policy should be.
Okay, fair enough. Which brings us to the next question. What family policy? Okay, you have 55 minutes. I'm going to go get a drink.
Yeah.
So joking aside,
Yeah.
to sort of narrow the scope, so one issue that I think we should start with is the child tax credit, because there's going to be a big tax fight next year. It's been, both campaigns had child tax credit proposals. So something's something's likely to happen there. And the issue with the child tax credit, God help me, I've been involved in these discussions since the 20 2010s, maybe. Um, there's a lot of devils in the details. JD Vance came out with a proposal during the campaign, which was, endorsed by Donald Trump, and in it's sort of, oh yeah, kind of way. And we're dealing with a huge, fiscal problems, and all sorts of tax promises have been made. So, you know, again, the why and the what. So why is a child tax credit a good idea? And B, like, how should it be structured? And C, what's the most realistic good way it should be structured?
Yeah, man, no, an hour is probably not
Yeah,
enough time
that's
to go
yes,
through all that.
that's still a lot.
So, I think it's important to, start with just the basic, right? So, child tax credit, the way it works currently, you at the end of the year, you file your taxes. If you have a positive federal income tax liability, you can subtract $2,000 per child from that, right? And so that used to be $1,000 in 2017. Trump signed his Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that doubled it to $2,000. That's scheduled to revert back to $1,000 if Congress doesn't do anything next year. I think that's pretty unlikely. I think politicians don't want to raise taxes on millions of American parents, so they'll do something. The question is what. And then you get into this, as I sort of alluded to in the previous question, this question of like, okay, well, what if a family has a single, earner who's only making 35 or $40,000 a year with two or three kids? They're not going to have much of any federal tax liability at all. Do we just say sucks for you? Do we give them the full value of that as a check, or do we give them some portion of that as a check? Right now, you can get up to, I think, $1,600 of that as a per child as a refundable check on top of your tax return. So there's been various proposals to think about that, because if you're, the canonical sort of, Republican, back when, you and the Reformicons were talking about this in the early 2010s, the sort of classic, response from a lot of, sort of mainstream Republican types was like, oh, sure, well, we love tax cuts and we love parents, so why don't we just give parents a tax cut? I'm on board with that. The where the rubber hits the road is, again, especially as the parties are realigning and as Republicans are becoming the party of, you know, middle income, lower working class, Hispanic.
Multiracial working class coalition. Say it three
Exactly.
times every
Say
time
it
you
with
get out
me,
of
right?
bed.
Yeah. They don't they're not benefiting from increasing the value of the tax
No.
cut because they're not making that much, right? If you're making, again, below median income, and you have two kids, it's very easy not to be benefiting from the full value of that. And so how you design that, and then you get into these battles that, again, you wear the scars of all these white papers about, labor force participation and single parenthood and all this kind of stuff. It can get pretty
I've
wonky, but
seen white papers you people wouldn't believe.
exactly. And they keep coming. So, but
So
directionally,
the basic point is, And the way we used to put it is that Republicans are victims of their own success, right? Because half of the people in America are not paying income tax because Republicans have been so good at cutting taxes. Um, and so the basic notion is, if you're giving somebody a tax, if you're giving individuals or filing entities, families, uh tax cuts on their income tax, it's not going to affect most
The
or a huge thing.
47%, trigger warning for those who remember 2012, who aren't paying income tax. But
And
yeah,
also, given the fact that we have this realignment, a lot of these people are people who either vote for us or would like to vote for us if they got something out of it. Um, so yeah, so that's the basic framing. And yeah, you're right. Like a lot of mainstream Republicans, um, I don't know if the word is mainstream now or establishment or whatever,
right. Traditional Reagan.
blanch at the idea that somebody would be getting a check from the federal government because all of a sudden it's no longer a tax cut, it's welfare. But as you point out, it's more of an accounting difference in both cases.
Right. And this is
It's
where
money coming out of the treasury and going to people.
right. And this is where to put a fine point on that, though, like where the left goes wrong on this is to say, well, then let's just get rid of all this fiction of working and non-working, all this kind of stuff, and just make it universal, like we did for 6 months under the Biden administration. And what we saw both in polling, which suggested that the universal CTC was not as popular as the Biden administration projected it would be, and also in some focus groups that I did with our friend Brad Wilcox and others, where we pulled together working class parents and said, "What do you think of this new policy?" And I was really, naively maybe surprised by how many of them said, look, it just feels like people are going to game the system, that they're getting something for nothing, that they don't have skin in the game. I'm out here busting my, butt to, try to make ends meet. And, or, the proverbial neighbor down the street who's not working is going to be getting this money the same way I am. That doesn't feel right to me. And so it's important, we're talking about the working class, right? We want to have some connection to work, whether that's a phase in or some threshold at which you have to meet, $10,000 worth of earnings or whatever that is. Tying it to participation in the labor force makes total sense. And again, this is a long-standing debate on the right. But what's important to stress is once you hit that, or once you have that skin in the game, recognizing that just increasing the amount that you can deduct from your taxes isn't actually benefiting this
Yes.
population. Again, lots of minority parents, lots of
Yeah.
lower income, blue collar parents that at least lip service Republicans say they're very interested in catering to.
Yeah, I mean this is, and I've had this conversation many times with people who are, even more on the sort of quote unquote integralist or sort of more Catholic side of the aisle. Well, not the aisle, the whatever. Um, this is a huge deal, and in a sense, it's good for us that Biden ran the experiment. Like, people, and in an understandable way, very, very are very hostile to the idea of people getting benefits in exchange for quote unquote nothing. And you can make a philosophical point about how, having babies is a blah, 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 blah. Okay, fair enough. But ordinary citizens, and again, if we want to be the party of the working class, we have to actually listen to our voters. Um, don't see it that way. And it's very clear from Europe. So the UK, especially, has a universal child benefit. And for decades, you had, basically it was the bread and butter of The Sun, which is the populist working class newspaper. Basically, every week you had this story about, the woman with 8 kids making 150 grand a year and not working. And like this would drive working people insane. And the solution in the UK, which is just absolutely the worst, is that you only get child benefits for the first two children. which is just the most terrible policy
And
ever.
some states in the U.S. adopted similar. This was the era of the welfare queen in the 80s, and they
Yep.
adopted similar what's called family caps, right, in their state welfare policies, where if you
Yep.
had another child, you would be barred from accessing additional public benefits. You were capped at the amount. So it was the idea that we don't want people to just pump out babies to collect the welfare check. Whether or not that was true in the 80s, I think it tends to be pretty overblown. But the thing I would stress is, as we, zoom out from questions of tax policy, we all know what birth rates are doing all across the
Right.
globe. And especially here in the US, the biggest driver of our declining birth rate since 2007 has been a decrease in out of wedlock births. Marital
Okay.
fertility has actually remained fairly steady since then. And it's really been a 20% decline in births to single women that has been the biggest driver. And so, in some respects, it's a monkey's paw victory for conservatives, right? We sort of wish, if only single parenthood would decline, and we got it, but those women didn't end up getting married and having kids. They're just not
Right.
having
We want you
kids.
to get married and have kids. We don't want you to like abort your unplanned pregnancy.
Right, right. So, all that is to say that the sort of socioeconomic landscape of, well, we don't want to pay people to have babies of the 70s, the overpopulation concerns, right? Those are just out the
Right.
window, in my opinion. I think the more substantive reason, again, that the sort of political sense of like, we got to have, some sense of skin in the game, and also the long term, you want to have we want to be incentivizing people to do the right thing, and that's have a stable job, participating in society.
Right.
That
Right.
we know the benefits to kids are much higher if they're if they have a parent in the workforce. So I
Right.
don't think we want
Exactly.
to do socialism light over here, but something to recognize that people who don't have tax liability aren't going to benefit from a tax cut, I think has to be on the table for
Yep.
Republicans in 2025.
Yeah. So I mean, just to finish on this point, I think the way to look at it is that it's bad for children to grow up in a household where nobody is working. Like that's not a good, especially low income family where nobody's working. That's just not a good scene. And so, in that sense, it's just perfectly. And again, like the politics are just brutal. And so, it, two things for Republicans to understand. Number one, refundability is okay because that's how we reach the voters that we like and want. And number two, work requirements, very important. Um, uh, okay, so let's talk, and then we'll talk about something other than child tax credit. But
No, no,
let's
I
talk.
love talking about the child tax credit.
Let's do a full hour on the child tax credit.
Anytime.
Um, let's talk amount. So I know you're not a. I don't think you're a budget guy particularly. But do you have any thoughts on how much quote unquote we can afford?
Yeah, it's the short answer is I don't think anybody really knows. And even if you talk to Republicans on Capitol Hill, they'll sort of play games with the baseline, right? Congress does these projections, and they say, well, yes, the Trump tax cuts are scheduled to expire at the end of this year, but what if we just pretended that they weren't? Isn't this sort of
Right.
$4 billion or $4 trillion of free money we can play with? Which you wouldn't do if you were sincerely concerned about our nation's fiscal health, which I think we should be, right? I wrote a piece for
Right.
National Review 2022, I think, saying, look, if it's all well and good to talk about family policy, and again, that's my bread and butter, but a little bit of old time supply sideism has to be part of the conversation, both in terms of housing, healthcare, education, some of these things which need sort of supply side forces, but also just you economic growth is not sufficient, as we can talk about, right, in addressing family formation, but it is necessary. People aren't going to want to form families
Yes.
when they feel like they can't afford it, as we've seen
Yes.
the last couple of years of runaway inflation, what that does, and so boosting the economic capacity of the economy through supply side reforms, yeah, it sounds a little bit like the 1980s are here again, but it's important, and it's you can't, again, the Biden administration showed us that you can't spend your way out of a cost of living crisis. You need to be targeting areas of the economy. So, you know, tax policy is all well and good, but I don't think it's sufficient. And so, something like child tax credit, I think, I've played around with the budget calculators, and I think you can do some, we increased it to 2,000 per child in 2017. If you just index that for inflation, because it's been so high, just accounting for
Right.
that since 2017, you'd have to raise it to 2,500. I'd love to see it go higher, but I think that's where 2,500, maybe 3,000 per child is going to be where a lot of congressional Republicans come in at, because that's doable budget
Right.
wise. It's still expensive, but compared to all the other things that they want to do, no tax on tips and no tax on this and that and corporate expensing and all that kind of stuff. They're going to have to decide what they actually prioritize, and I'm really hoping that child tax credit makes it onto that short list. But again, it's not the be all and end all of pro family policy.
Yeah. So, well, perfect segue. Thank you very much. So, pick a topic. Like, what would you say is the most important if it's not the child tax credit?
Yeah, I'll pick on one that I know you and I have tweeted about over the years, or xed about over the years. I'm still, I know YIMBYism gets a bad rap, and some of its proponents are pretty obnoxious, and some of the most
See,
high profile.
that's what I wrote. I wrote YIMBY on
Yes, there
my
you go. Yes, in my backyard, for those who aren't online, although I imagine a lot of your podcast listeners are very
yeah.
online.
You could probably assume that they're extremely online and extremely nerdy.
So, and we can all imagine the sort of, stereotypical San Francisco liberal, YIMBYism type stuff. And, it's not necessarily pro family per se. However, I think if you're concerned about family formation, which I think we should be as people on the right, it's impossible to look at that and not see the element of housing affordability on there. And yeah, we can think about, maybe first time home buyer credits or giving people property tax reductions for having kids, that can make some, differences around the margins. And, you can kind of play around with that if you want to. But ultimately, the only way you're going to be able to bring the cost of housing down so that people just starting out can afford that kind of canonical starter home is, I hate this phrase that's sweeping the internet, but abundance, right? The sort of housing, you know, approach that says yes in my backyard, and duplexes, and also greenfield development and environmental laws and all that kind of stuff, which hamstring the growth of new housing. But I really think that you know if you want people to be able to afford to start a family in their 20s as opposed to in their early
Right.
mid 30s, uh, which is a huge driver of declining fertility, you have to make it possible for them to be able to start a life together, and that, housing is the biggest ticket expense on that.
Yeah. So, all right. So let's have a debate.
Yeah.
Sort of. I mean, no. But I am going to play devil's advocate. Um, there's a couple things. So it's a spectrum, right? It's especially when you talk about housing, it's like how much do you allow, etc. It's not full libertarianism versus zero new housing. Um, I do like to make a contrarian case for NIMBY because every nerd in our world is basically a YIMBY. Um, and it's totally a coincidence that they happen to be in their 20s and can't afford a house. Um, but basically, ordinary people, middle and upper middle class people, lawyers, doctors, engineers, accountants, made you know bought houses and made financial sacrifices, bought houses for extra money, but more expensive houses, specifically because they wanted to live for decades in a specific community that has a specific character. Uh, I think that's legitimate. I think, they paid extra for a kind of assurance that, 20 years from now, their neighborhood is going to be sort of the same way as when they bought it. I don't see that as illegitimate. I don't see that as sort of like naked greed. And more to the point, because this is so personal, they're going to be politically very organized. Hell hath no fury like a upper middle class person whose real estate values are threatened. Like,
Right.
obviously there's an element of greed, but so is there. But it's not just that. It's not just that. It's a very human aspiration, and one which is understandable, and one which is, I think, not illegitimate. And so, in this sense, I kind of want to stand up for the most underprivileged faction in American society, which is people who are sitting on a bunch of unearned housing wealth. Uh,
Right. You're right.
but I mean, I don't know. I just like pointing this out also because it's the difference between it's like the thing about working class people being pissed off at people who get benefits for having kids. It's how normal people think, and
It
people
is.
like us need to like be able to put ourselves in the shoes of normal people.
No, you're totally right. In the sense that like it is a natural instinct. It's I think it's the Dartmouth economist Bill Fischel who dubbed this the home voter hypothesis, right? Who said basically like people treat this as a form of almost insurance, right? That
Yeah,
like you make this huge purchase, the biggest purchase most of us will ever make in our lifetime, and when you're getting ready to sell it, you want to make sure you're not going to take a huge hit, right? This is a source of retirement income in a sense, your sort of nest egg. If you are, if you buy this house in 1999 and in 2014 some guy comes along, it's like, I'm going to put a, mega, apartment building, public housing or something next door, like, yeah, it's totally natural to feel this sense of like, well, I thought it was, sort of investing, and now you're going to take that away. On the other hand, I think so. I think the sort of classic, libertarian case is like, well, you didn't buy the neighborhood, right? You bought your house, you bought your property, and you don't have a, I think that's kind of a cold-hearted libertarian answer. So I wouldn't counsel that to my more, red-blooded YIMBY brethren to lean on that too heavily. Instead, I would say I think we're getting better, and by we I mean again the sort of side that's inclined towards liberalizing housing regulations, acknowledging that for a while it was like, well, if you're NIMBY, you're just racist, right? You don't want those people living next to you, or you're classist or whatever. I think people are recognizing, look, you can do density and you can expand housing stock in a way that can be, again, duplex, triplex, townhouse, that kind of thing, can be have a very modest footprint where it looks the same as a single family
right,
home or very similar. It's not, a six-story building in a suburban environment, but smaller lot sizes, uh, grandma units, all that kind of stuff, where you're just increasing the options that are available. And that's the other thing. I think sometimes people make the mistake where they go, well, yeah, you're right. We need to build a bunch of single family homes in the suburbs and keep sprawling out, who's the guy from California? Yeah, well, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to name names, but like the sort of idea, we just need to continue to sprawl out. And it's like, there's some people who definitely want that. But if you are building more studio apartments and small houses and starter homes and that sort of thing, you're also freeing up the existing housing stock, right? Where right
right,
now, if you live in, the Bay Area or Seattle or something, you might have a single family home where two or three, tech bros can share the house and go in, and you're out competing a family. If you build more, smaller apartments where they can live elsewhere, free up some of that space, I think you'd also, the sort of ripple effect is sometimes underrated too. So, I'm definitely not a let's get rid of every zoning everywhere kind of thing, but I think it's important to remember what it was initially for, which was nuisances and sort of undesirable factories and that sort of thing. I think re-understanding what zoning is, saying, okay, it's let's keep the thing, and nobody wants to live next to a glue factory, right? Let's keep those out of town. But in our suburban areas, having more diversity in housing styles and housing stock, I think it has to be part of the problem, because I think the mistake, again, that natural inclination of, well, I want to preserve what I have. Again, I get it. On the other hand, if you keep it in stasis, it's only going to become less. You're not able to build. Your kids are not going to have that same opportunity, right? Because the price is only going to go up, and so if you want to be possible for your kids to have grandkids or whatever that is, you have to be willing to say, well, we got to have more housing somewhere. Maybe it's not quite in my backyard, but down the street is fine.
Okay, so round two. So I've made the sort of general anti-YIMBY case. Now I'm going to make the anti-YIMBY case specifically as relates to family policy. Because so the pro-YIMBY case for family policy is very simple. If you can't afford to buy a house, you can't afford to have a family. YIMBY means lower prices, more people can buy houses, therefore they can have families, have kids. Okay, one of the strongest negative correlates with fertility is square footage of living space. And so, there's this notion, oh, we're all gonna, this is not so much YIMBY as such, it's more like walkability and all that stuff. Like, in real life, average people who are not Dutch, shut up about the Dutch. I'm not saying you. I'm just ranting against the internet right
You're
now.
always going to go there. Yeah.
But shut up about the Dutch.
Yeah.
Non-Dutch people will not put like three kids on a bicycle and bike around. One of the great things about America is like those really big houses with yards and stuff. And actually, um the proposition that people will have more kids if they have, you know, if they get like an apartment that's more affordable earlier versus a house that's bigger that they may not be able to afford right away, but that they think of as, oh, this is a house where I want to live and have a family. I don't think it's as straightforward as it looks. I don't know how you would be able to measure that, if you would be able to measure that. But anyway, I've done my rant.
No, that's
Explain why
fine.
I'm wrong.
I'm here for the anti-urbanist, contrarian takes. I think, for the one on the one hand, I think there's a point at which, the average age. I should have looked this up. The average age for first time home buyer is at its highest it's ever been, and it's either 35. It's 34, 35, 36,
Yeah,
somewhere in.
yes,
And this is, again, just people buying their first home, right? And so if you think about that just in biological terms, right? Unless
yes.
we know that marriage and home buying are correlated. Although a lot of nowadays, a lot of people are buying houses before they get married, which seems like a big financial risk. I don't want to necessarily encourage people to do, but that's what people are doing. If we want people to be having kids earlier in life, asking them to wait until they've bought a house at age 36 is really compressing, if for women especially, your fertility window
Yep.
into a couple years. So I would say we've aired them too far in that direction on the one hand. On the other, okay, sure, yeah, not everybody wants to live in Amsterdam or New Amsterdam or whatever the case may be. On the other, I do think, so part of this is the suburbs arose out of the decline of the American city, and cars obviously accelerated this, but the sense of like urban decline and decay, and there's some push and pull factors there, but if we can have public spaces that are, I know you had Charles Lehman on a couple, previous episodes ago. If we can make urban life more family friendly by having it be less filled with vagrants and marijuana smoke. That will help, but also the the way that we live our lives, right? This sort of car dependent suburban lifestyle is great for a lot of people, and I'm not here to say they're wrong to like it. We live in a sort of pre-war suburb here in South Carolina, and it's very walkable, and I really enjoy that. I think Tim Carney's book, Family Unfriendly, talks about contrasting his experiences in different parts of DC where they can send their kids down the street to the neighbor's house, and kind of kids roaming around people's backyards, because it's built to be able to do that. And if you live in a cookie cutter suburb, you might not be able to do that, depending, or maybe there's a big
Yeah.
divided median going through your neighborhood, or whatever that is. So we have to be intentional with how we design these things. You can certainly have you know traditional suburbia that is more family friendly than one that assumes that people are going to be driving everywhere, and want to be stuck in the car line at school drop off and pick up, right? I think we can be thinking about these pain points that parents experience, again, school pickup, or all the forms and bureaucracy around healthcare, and we can talk about childbirth and all that kind of stuff. I think part of the reason why stuff like make birth free and some of these other sort of gimmicky ideas that some of our friends pick up on is, obviously there's some financial cost, that we can pick up, but also just like the headache of getting a bill for your kid's birth the year after they're born,
Right.
and like, oh, there's another $2,000 I didn't know I had to pay, all this kind of stuff. These are where I think a pro family mindset to how are we designing our roads? How are we designing our healthcare systems? How are we designing our tax code and our employee benefits and all these sort of things? If we're prioritizing family as the core unit, right, of society
Yeah.
rather than the sort of abstract individual, I think it leads us to different design choices. And that's where I think, conservatives traditionally were very good talking about this in sort of lip service ways. I think the opportunity for the new right, and we're getting our daily flyby here. Sorry about that. The new right is to really put muscle on the bone because they're not as hamstrung by, well, this isn't something government should be doing. Um, but there's opportunities, and concerns are too, where they can go sometimes too far in different directions. But that's I think it's an exciting chance for folks who are sort of more new right adjacent to be thinking about what would it look like to have the family be in the driver's seat of policy.
I mean, I certainly agree with that general sentiment that, the family really is the basic unit of society. It's an incredibly trite phrase, but it's just like factually true. And
Right.
now that the birth rates are declining, we're sort of learning it in the most painful way possible. So just to close out on this, of course, the way to square the circle of everything we've been discussing about housing is self-driving cars, because you can expand out indefinitely, and then once everybody switched to self-driving, the car zips along at 200 kph, which is however miles per hour. You uncivilized colonials, whatever unit that is. And so you can have your house in an exurb somewhere and your job in a skyscraper in the center of the city, and your commute is 20 minutes, and it's cheap. And so
No, I, I
that's the
actually
sort of pro tech. The I'm pro family and pro tech, so, and I think there's a lot of ways that these two sort of mesh together.
I like that idea with the caveat that in your exurb, I think it's much more. So let's imagine a future, right? Because I think we saw in the wake of COVID, the rise of remote work actually led to a little uptick in births among college educated women because they were able to balance, work and family life in ways. Commutes went down. People were able to, maybe they used to go to the office every day. Now they're going in 2 or 3 days a week. And I know there's pluses and minuses to that. But you could imagine a world in which you're living out in your exurb, which is your village in a sense, right? If we
Yep.
build these sort of town centers and the sort of downtown where people are, meeting and going to the market and going to church and seeing each other in their small community. And then you go into town, sort of almost a colonial approach where you go in for do your business 2 or 3 days a week, and you can use that time to catch up on work or whatever you're doing in your self-driving car. There's a lot that appeals to that, right? But again, thinking about how people live their life, it's not just living out there isolated, right? I think there's a reason why there were so many sort of 1960s, 1970s, novels and movies about how isolated the suburbs felt, was because again, it was reacting to this sort of chaos of an uncivilized urban environment by we're creating these very sterile, places where you sometimes don't interact with anybody. I think finding that happy medium of having these
Right.
small town feels. I think a lot of people, we see this right in the most expensive real estate in America is in places like Alexandria, Virginia, or Charlestown, or South Carolina, or Vail, Colorado. These sort of like recreating that sort of village mindset or experience where people can see each other and get to know their neighbors. There's a lot that people find appealing about that.
Yep. All right. Next item. This is a bit of a challenge. Craziest pro family policy that you can think of. Craziest in the good way, like most out of left field, most unconventional, but that you like.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I feel like the Overton window has shifted so much on this over the last
Yeah.
5 years or so, right? Like, if you had asked me this in 2019, I'd be like, "Oh, well, there's this guy, who I saw speak at some conference where he's talking about indemnity voting and giving parents,
Uh,
he's the vice president of the United States." So in that sense, what was once crazy, I think, and also we're seeing just crazy and sometimes I almost think too much, right? Ways of trying to address fertility. South Korea, Japan. We don't need to rehash the problems they have, but they're throwing tons of money trying to incentivize births, and it's not really successful. But it's interesting, right? And so it does point to the fact that, like, money doesn't solve all these problems, and in fact, if you're worried about the decline of fertility and the decline of the family, you also have to be willing to say, hey, look, economic growth isn't the silver bullet here either, because as the economy grows, as the opportunity cost of having kids go up, then it becomes relatively more expensive. You're having to give up more to have kids. So that's a big reason why fertility is dropping. Anyway, craziest current sort of envelope pushing idea is you know, I think, well, I don't know, but I gotta think about if there's anyone I don't want to throw anyone under the bus by calling their idea crazy. I think there's a interesting bank shot maybe that I've seen lately was a paper from the Heritage Foundation, which is very sort of classic, traditional conservative, think tank, trying to make the case that universal school choice is the sort of pronatalist thing to do. And their argument was because universal school choice will allow more parents to send their kids to religious schools. Those kids will then grow up to be more religious, and therefore they will have more kids down the line. It's not crazy, in my opinion. It's very expensive, but again, is it more expensive than something like Japan's, or South
I
Korea
mean,
style, baby bonus type stuff? Yeah, I don't think it is. So there's lots of reason for conservatives to be excited about school choice in general, but I think the sort of pronatalist argument, again, it's a little bit of a bank shot. I'm not totally sure if it holds water all the way through, but at least it's worth exploring.
interesting. I thank you for bringing up demani voting, or basically the idea that people have more votes if they have more kids. That's a
My
very
wrinkle
good
on
one.
that, I'll just say, and this is not, this is not even worth, tossing out in a policy conversation, but I would love to see, if you want to vote, you have to change a diaper in the last 2 years, whether that's an infant diaper or an adult diaper. I think it's important for us to be remembered that we have obligations in society that don't aren't always glamorous, that we are dependent at both ends of life, and especially with threats to human dignity on both ends of the spectrum these days. I think it's encouraging people who aren't otherwise seeing the various stages of the life cycle. Again, maybe voting's not the right carrot on the end of that stick, but we gotta recognize the dignity of dependence, or whatever that is,
Yeah.
and what it means to serve others. More diapers. Dogs don't count.
That's a good one. I sort of collect. You had these in the original French colonies in North America. You had crazy things like you get extra beaver pelts for child number 7, or
Yeah.
they made it illegal to be unmarried after the age of 23. I mean, just
Yeah, I mean, there's a long. I mean, Caesar Augustus passed
yeah,
a very punitive tax on bachelors, and it wasn't especially successful. People would find ways around it, but I mean, the idea that like we got to do something about our marriage crisis is not unique to modernity. It's just that what is unique to modernity, I think, is the fact that people now have the option to experience all the benefits of marriage without actually ever getting
yeah,
married, right? You can get on an app and find a sex partner. You can have a kid, but basically through an app these days. You can have all the social and economic benefits of cohabitation. These used to be bundled up in an
right,
exclusive good we called marriage, and
right.
now we've essentially debundled that, right? Where they're just a la carte. And so I think if we're concerned about fertility, which I think is a broad thing that captures the right across the broad spectrum. Upstream of that is marriage, and again, marriage rate and fertility rates within marriage are fairly steady. So if you're concerned about that, you need to be concerned about getting people married earlier. Figuring out ways to raise the social status or the economic benefits associated with marriage, I think, has to be part of the conversation.
So yeah, my idea. I've been thinking about it while not listening to your answer. Uh,
Nobody else is going to listen
I'm
to it either.
I'm joking. Um, no, but this I nobody cares about my idea, but this is a good segue into a topic we can maybe close on. But basically, what I would do, the sort of less post-liberal version would be to sort of fund pro-family media like TV shows and so on and so forth. There's the famous study about telenovelas in Brazil. But there's a huge cultural element. Like we'll probably have Lyman Stone on the podcast at some point. He believes that paying people to have kids works. But like everybody agrees that culture is a huge deal. Um, what you know, what if anything can policy achieve? So first of all, A, do you agree? But B, if so, what if anything can policy achieve to sort of shift the culture to a more pro-family direction, in a way that's plausible in this sort of contemporary American political context?
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head. I think even Lyman, I don't think would argue the idea that culture is a huge
Yeah.
determinant, right? And I don't mean to say even Lyman. I think because he's the proponent of sort of aggressive fiscal stimulus. I think, but again, he would argue. He would point to the famous example in the country of Georgia where the patriarch agreed to baptize third children or higher, and they saw an increase in family size. So obviously culture can have an impact. I don't think that Oprah or Taylor Swift offering to baptize the children of the higher parity children of families would have much of an impact. But we would somebody of that sort of universal acclaim might help. In seriousness, I think culture is that black box for economists, right? Well, we just sort of don't know really what's going on. We can't really describe it. So we just kind of chalk it. We know, as you point out, telenovelas in Brazil, 16 and Pregnant in the US. When that show came out on MTV, it showed that there's studies that show rates of teen pregnancy dropped because teen girls saw the difficulties that moms who were in their teens were facing, and were like, I'm going to be more intentional about birth control or abstinence or whatever it is. And so the question to me is, can policy do anything directly? And I'm not enough of a post liberal to go there necessarily. Although again, I think some would definitely bite that bullet, but indirectly 100%. And we had the national campaign to reduce teen pregnancy
Right.
that led to some of this stuff. Very successful. Some would say too successful, because we're now seeing not just teen birth rates declining, but that's carrying on to early 20s, mid 20s, that sort of thing. So
Right.
maybe we overshot the mark on that, but something where we're using government as a convener and encouraging, I think, if this airs before Christmas, folks will see the online chatter about these ads from, I think, Volvo and Apple, which are sort of more pro
Right.
family than
Right.
you usually see from big corporations. Maybe that's happening organically and we don't need to do anything about it. And that's great. But I think encouraging that sort of thing, in bringing the big media companies together and saying, hey, look, we've been all in on sort of family diversity for a long time. Are there ways that we can, again, find interesting and creative and challenging, but again, creatively rewarding stories about family that are not just about modern family kind of stuff. Maybe not. The bullet pulpit is good, but I would caution, on the flip side of that, is that there is a polarizing effect as well. And I think, as we saw with the childless cat ladies controversy over the summer, being too heavy-handed with some of the cultural messaging and some of the efforts from a Republican administration or whatever can sometimes have that thermostatic reaction where people say, well, who are you to get in my personal business? And so it has to be, you have to lead with some empathy and some charity and some humility, rather than being you know uh Muskian maybe about some of this stuff, because
Did you
I
say
don't think,
Muskian?
you know referring to Elon Musk,
I
because
mean, he's not
he's
he I mean, he's like he talks about how he has a lot of children and he likes having children and he worries about birth rates, but
yeah.
he's not prescriptive.
uh he's
And
not
he
going to
doesn't
force
seem to
people
have
to have kids, but
publicly supported anything in the family policy space, even though he's, quite vocal about the policies he does support.
well, right, well, yeah, so I mean, and he's a
I mean, I'm
idiosyncratic.
not I'm not particularly in the business of defending Elon. Elon, if you're listening, Sphere accepts advertising. We can advertise some rockets in here. But
Yeah. Yeah, the pro family
I just wondered why you use that term, but
No, because I think he shows a vision of pronatalism that I don't think is helpful for conservatives to pursue.
okay, but why?
Because, well, again, his personal life is it is what it is. But I
Right,
think this idea that pronatalism means having as many kids as biologically are able, outside of the construct of a healthy family. Again, if you're the richest man in the world, I'll cut you some slack. I'm not too worried about his kids, but if you're only talking about fertility, you're not talking about marriage. I think that's a problem for the vast majority of men. Also, and women, but also, the sort of Silicon Valley tinged pronatalism, where it becomes about pre-genetic testing and
right,
relying on IVF and a lot of these technologies that end up
right,
in a sort of soft eugenics direction, I think is troublesome for conservatives to approach wholeheartedly. There's very vocal proponents of self-described pronatalism that I think have no problem with identifying gene or embryos on different gene traits and that sort of thing. I think that is really troublesome if you have a traditional view of human dignity. Now, again, this
right,
splits the right. I know there's plenty of sort of techno optimist folks who are all on board with that, and this is a debate that we have to have as conservatives. But I think the sort of traditional understanding of the family and my positioned as sort of this, old stodgy stick in the mud social conservative is no, marriage and family are the, that's the vehicle for thousands of years with we've, come across as a species that's
Yep.
most conducive to a healthy outcome for kids. And playing with eugenics and playing with surrogacy and some of these things is not going to end up leading us in a healthy direction.
Right. Okay. So now I understand what you meant by Muskin.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, fair enough. Like, I'm a Catholic too. And it's funny because these are the hardest decisions to have, the hardest discussions to have. Like, I've had
They
discussions
are, and
with
they're only going
people,
to
and
get.
if I tell them, oh, I support the Inquisition having, burning heretics, they'd be like, well, okay, I don't agree, but I see your point. And then if I say, oh, I think surrogacy should be illegal, they're like, what?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
And so it because they all know somebody who had a child through a surrogate or whatever. So
And
yeah,
again,
there's that
it's
sort of
what.
intra-coalitional dynamic.
Right, and I'll analogize it to the NIMBY discussion that we had, right? Where it's a totally healthy, natural, beautiful desire to want to have a kid, and especially to have a kid you have some biological relation to, and people are often fed lies about how easy it will be to delay fertility, and you get to your late 30s and you go, oh my gosh, this is just not work. I get it, and we want to, and that's why I'm so passionate about wanting to help people get started earlier in life so they're not led down a heartbreaking path later in life. At the same time, I think we got it doesn't do us any good to pretend there aren't big moral differences here in terms of you know one path. The US is very much the Wild West when it comes to some of these bioethical questions.
Yeah.
Sex selective embryos and sex selective abortions and all these sort of things that I think with lead to these really interesting. I don't hate talking about it at all. I think it's fun to think about what is authentically pro-family mean. And again, I don't. I'm not here trying to usher in the integralist Catholic state. I think there's totally
I
viable ways
am.
to reform what we have rather than trying to ban outright IVF or something like that. I don't think anybody's in favor of that, but there's once you start talking about what does pro-family mean, as we kind of started out this conversation, what is
Right.
pro-family? I think it all comes back down to essentially the kids that are produced from marriage and trying to do what's best for them.
Yeah. I mean, this I mean, you've touched on a very interesting point, and we just have a few minutes left, but there's Elon's the sort of most famous sort of spearhead, spokesman, whatever. But there was this not insignificant group of people, particularly associated with Silicon Valley, who understand that the problem of birth rates is a very serious problem. That if we're going to have all of the techno acceleration that we need, you need people. You need people to build the rockets. You need people to man the rockets. You need people to um,
Mars or whatever.
people
Yeah.
the Mars colony. Um, and but you're right, they come at it from a generally post-religious perspective, and they usually have beliefs on things like, yeah, IVF, surrogacy, genetics, quote unquote eugenics. I hate that term because it covers, a, it's a scarecrow term, and b, it covers like a huge spectrum of things. um uh you know it goes from like, oh, I want to get married with somebody who's handsome and intelligent, down to Nazi Germany, and like um so anyway, but that, I mean, I guess the question is, and then we can wrap up. I guess the question is, what do you think of that phenomenon? What do you think of this new sort of emerging discourse about birth rates? Because again, like, on the one hand, we share a very important common goal, but on the other, we also have like pretty significant differences.
Yeah. What's that famous Ross Douthat tweet from I think 2015, 2016? If you if you don't like the religious right, just wait till you meet the post-religious right. And I think that sums up some of what's going on here. I think you're right to note that, like, and the Republican Party in general, as it's become the sort of working class, party that we're talking about, is intentionally, as certainly President Trump is intentionally leaving behind some of that moral language, right? At the GOP
Right.
platform, talking about personhood and all this sort of stuff, dropping mentions to marriage, these sort of traditional social conservative concerns. I think, religious conservatives, especially, are being, you know, coming to grips what it means to be junior coalition members rather than, having a big boy seat at the table. And that, runs the gamut, right? From, whether or not we subsidize IVF for the federal government to what sort of, how far we can go with some of these more, Silicon Valley pronatalist types who end up sort of espousing technologies we think are morally problematic. To again, abortion itself, and we haven't really touched on that, but that's always been a core focus of a lot of conservatives. That I think my projection is very soon it will fade at least to the back burner in a lot of conservative efforts, just because trans and CRT and sort of these other things are what unites sort of post religious cultural conservatism rather than the sort of traditional social conservatism that focuses on abortion and marriage and that sort of thing. And so it's again, I think it's a huge challenge to figure out exactly, where we can agree. Yeah, birth rates are a problem. Yeah, falling for family formation isn't good. Not just economics and colonizing Mars, but it's not good for people to be living in the pod and eating bugs and all your interaction is over OnlyFans,
Right.
right? I mean, that's not a life well lived. And so if we are wanting people to have a life of flourishing or whatever, like talking about making it easier to pair off and start families and be part of the community in that way. Yeah, are there ways that we can do that with partners who we fundamentally disagree with on some moral questions? Yeah. Are there ways we can do that we could part with maybe some people of goodwill on the left, even, right, who sort of Richard Reeves esque people on the left who say, well, maybe conservatives did have a point about male declining fortunes or that sort of thing.
Right.
I think the fact that sort of traditional religious conservatism is sailing off into the West a little bit does open up doors for new opportunities, because some of those old fault lines around again, gay marriage or maybe abortion in a couple of years, those are going to be fading in preeminence. So I think there'll be opportunities, but I'm going to be who I always am, right? Sort of, again, a gadfly about pointing out that there are downsides to some of this stuff too, and whoever those partners look like, I'm still going to be annoyingly prodding them, saying, look, there are issues with this if we embrace it too fully. So
Yeah. I mean, so and I guess we'll close on that because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I recently learned about artificial wombs. And what I mean by that is I've seen the phrase artificial wombs for decades or whatever. And I used to think, a machine, and then you put an embryo or a young fetus in this like white box. And then 9 months out, you take out a baby. And it's like, well, what's wrong with that? But no, that's not what an artificial womb is. An artificial womb is a clone of a woman whose brain you destroy so that you basically have like a brain dead human body, and that's what you implant the embryo in. And it's like, oh, like, okay, like burn it all down. Like, nuke it from orbit to make sure that nothing survives.
yeah,
Oh my god.
yeah.
This is just a factoid I wanted to throw out because, like, for 15 years, I was like, oh, artificial wombs, if we can do that, maybe that's a solution for abortion, or it's like, oh,
Yeah, I mean, eventually, I'm a conservative, right? So I believe that eventually all of my deeply held beliefs will be proven to be correct. I hope we don't have to experience that one firsthand before we recognize what a terrible idea that would be.
Oh my god. All right. Well, anyway, thank you so much for your time. You are one of the smartest people thinking and writing about this very important sort of galaxy of issues and ideas. People should follow you on X. They should subscribe to your podcast. Don't worry, I'll put that all in the description, so it's not just at the end. And yeah, thank you very much.
You're too kind. Anytime. Thanks so much.